I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. And I'm almost speechless, which hardly ever happens, but my mind is totally blown. I have been obsessing like a teenager over this Project Veritas video, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. I'm sure as a listener of this show and someone who's been following the vaccine story with me since the beginning, that you know all about it. But I think I have some new insights that make it even more interesting, actually. I went for a long walk this morning and with the dog, and spent some time talking to my best girlfriend about it, and who's also a journalist. And there's a whole bunch of ways to look at this, folks, and all of them are really interesting, and none of them say anything good at all about the pharmaceutical industry and legacy media and media in general. We are so totally screwed. But before I get to that, I want to announce who my guest is today, because he's someone I've wanted to have on the show really since the beginning. I've been a fan of his since I started reading really about American politics and culture in a serious way. His name is Chris Hedges, and he is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. He was with the New York Times as a war reporter for many years, and he has a new book out. And we're going to talk about the new book he has written is about war. It's called The Greatest Evil is War. And on that idea, he and I 1,001% agree. We're always pitched these terrible conflicts that in the end mean nothing except they wound and kill a bunch of lovely kids. And we forget about that when we're starting out in these events. And now, of course, tanks are going to Ukraine from both Germany and America, and apparently Canada too. And Putin is saying they're now officially or unofficially at war with NATO. So none of this is good. And we're going to talk to Chris Hedges about his new book about war and many other things, and a very interesting story that he had one piece of, and I have the other piece of, about a guy named Carlos Arredondo, who is featured in a book I wrote in 2006 about the Iraq War. Very interesting guy. So do stick around for that. It's a really important and interesting interview. He's much farther left than I am these days, but he's left mostly on all of the good things that we share. You know, we're pretty anti-war around here. We support poor people and working people. So on those issues, we agree. And he's terribly smart. And he's covered a lot of conflicts. He has as much experience, I believe, as any living war correspondent right now. So stick around for that. It's a real gift that we have him. So back to Project Veritas. It's like, what the hell happened yesterday? So the gist of the story, as I understand it, having watched the tape a few times, is that a guy by the name of Jordan Trishton Walker, a doctor who is said by James O'Keefe of Project Veritas, and they have documentation backing up the claim that he is a high-level executive with Pfizer, the director of R&D and other things. And there are a lot of documents floating around that seem to suggest that that is absolutely true. And in fact, he doesn't deny it either when he's so busted by the Project Veritas team. But this goes beyond anything they've ever done before. And, I have to say that as a former legacy media journalist, which I get sick of saying, the Project Veritas style, the Rebel News style, they're a little kind of over the top for me, but you know what? Nothing else is working. Doing what Project Veritas did, the kind of secret taping, we're not really allowed to do that in journalism. But if the big guys with all the money, which is corporate media, aren't going to do their jobs, then I can be nudged into the camp of some of these sting operations. I don't agree with everything Project Veritas does, and I don't always agree with their portrayal of what they managed to capture in these events. So let me just say that, right? But this incident is so bizarre and so important if true, and also exposes a whole bunch of other stuff about the time we live in. So let's go to it now. So this chap, Jordan Tristan, and it is Tristan, not Tristan, but Tristan Walker, apparently met the Project Veritas sting guy, some young guy working for James O'Keefe. Met him, I believe, on Grindr or some kind of a dating hookup app, right? He's gay. And they met for dinner at a pizza place, and Jordan Tristan Walker, after being prodded by the Veritas guy, who he thought was there for a hookup, I think, or a date, encouraged him to talk about his role at Pfizer. And he said the most incredible thing. He basically said that Pfizer is doing a kind of gain of function research that was mutating the virus so they could create vaccines to keep up with it, or something along those lines, right? Now, what's interesting about it, I mean, that's earth-shattering, but what's interesting about it, if you step back, is here is a guy who, if he is a Pfizer exec, is doing what pharmaceutical people never do. They sign 1,000,008 NDAs when they go to work for these big pharma companies. They get paid a lot of money, and one of the reasons they're paid a lot of money is so they keep their traps shut. So here is a guy, I think a recently new hire, because he's quite young and out of med school, like maybe in 20 or 21 or something, according to the paper trail that's quickly disappearing from online. So he's a reasonably new hire, probably getting big bucks. And here he is on what appears to be something like a Grindr date, trying to impress this person that he doesn't know by bragging about the fact that Pfizer is doing gain of function research for some competitive advantage to sell the vaccine. That's the gist of what he was saying. I mean, it's shocking. He says he was, I think the phrase he uses, we're talking about mutating it ourselves, or we are mutating it ourselves. So there's so much wrong with that. The fact that he would just loosely drop that on a stranger he doesn't know, that's enough to get him banned from the industry for life. So what the hell is he doing? What is the character of this person, right? He's not whistleblowing. He's not courageously saying what we're doing is bad and wrong, and I'm going to talk about it and expose it. He's sneakily saying it to some guy that he wants to get in the sack, right? So that's like even worse. So he's not trustworthy by Pfizer, and he's not trustworthy by the public because they're doing dangerous things, and he's not exposing it. Really shocking. The other thing he says that I think says a lot about him is he talks about this revolving door between industry and the regulatory agencies, both in Washington and in other major cities and Western governments. There's a lot of that stuff that goes on. And what it means is that people in the regulatory agencies are not lowering the boom on big pharma because they want to get rich when they retire from the agency and end up working for Pfizer. So he's talking about that. He's admitting, yes, that's a thing. It really is a thing. He's smiling when he's doing it. It's a grotesque admission. And what he's talking about, again, is really, it's immoral, right? It's a total violation of what the people in the regulatory agencies are supposed to be doing. We shouldn't be smiling about that, Dr. Walker. We should be pushing those people away. We should not be hiring people who will sell out the safety of Americans to get a big job in big pharma when they leave the regulatory agencies. But he said that, and he didn't criticize the practice. So, wow, are these the people working in big pharma? That was my take on it. This is just not a very moral human being, right? Like, is this the best big pharma has to offer? I don't know. It was That was as shocking to me as the gain of function stuff. So then after he kind of spills the tea, as they say, to his date, who's recording everything, the guy who runs Project Veritas, James O'Keefe, strolls in and with a camera rolling and tells the guy, he's busted, right? You work for Pfizer. Why did you say this? And he completely freaks out. Like, he has a meltdown, and a bunch of stuff happens during the meltdown too that also reveals the moment in time that we inhabit right now. He completely panics and says, I was lying. I was just trying to impress my date, or whatever phraseology he used. And you know what? That might be true. That could be true. He could have been lying about it to impress a date. Maybe it doesn't look that way, but he could have been lying to impress a date. We don't, from an evidentiary perspective, as a reporter, there's documentation that makes it look like he worked at Pfizer. And I don't think Pfizer has said so far today that he doesn't work there. And we also know that he's making this claim about this awful research they're allegedly doing. But we don't know that they're doing the research, right? So we have to kind of hold that in our heads too, just to be completely clear. This proves that he's saying it. It doesn't prove that it's actually happening. So he says he was lying about it to impress a date, and then he completely flips out. There's this, I'm going to play this for you in a minute, but there's a huge scene where he's kind of attacking James O'Keefe. He's instructing the people in the pizza place not to open the door. He tries to smash the iPad that was doing the recording. And then he does something that actually made me pretty mad. He says he's calling the police on James O'Keefe, who's done nothing to him, right? He's standing away. I think James O'Keefe has good lawyers, because he was not doing anything particularly intimidating against this guy. The guy just knew he was screwed, right? He calls the police and he says, I'm surrounded by white people, or 5 white people, and I'm not feeling very safe. That's what he says. And I thought, wow. So when you're well and truly busted for doing something immoral, if in fact that's what you're doing, your default position is to play the race card. That's also not a good look at all. So, and we can see that happening in real time, right? He's not under any threat. No one's going to hurt him. But he's trying to get the police there, I guess, to maybe help him recover the tape or something that they'd shot. So it's wild. It was a wild moment. And I don't normally cover Project Veritas tapes, but these tapes say as much about the time that we live in right now as they do about what Pfizer may or may not be doing in its labs. I was alerted yesterday I tweeted about this when it first happened, and I was alerted through my social media by a bunch of people I trust to watch out. This could be some kind of like a double agent sting operation. Maybe this guy is a plant to bring down Veritas and people who question vaccines. And the world we live in right now, who knows, right? Like, there is so much nefarious stuff going on. It's really, really hard to fully prove and understand information as it comes flying at us, right? So late yesterday afternoon, I was kind of like, well, I don't know. Can this be real? And then after watching Tucker Carlson last night and doing more research on it this morning, I feel that the best way to approach it is the way I'm approaching it, and saying it looks kind of legit. His behavior was certainly bizarre, like that of a guilty human being. It does not prove what Pfizer is doing per se, but wow. If in fact what he's saying is correct, and he is who it is being claimed he is, and there's evidence to suggest that's true, this is a massive story. So I'm going to follow up with what I learned this morning is happening as a result of this, because of course legacy media is not touching it. Imagine that. How can they not touch it? Why aren't they trying to prove that this guy is a faker? Or why aren't they going after James O'Keefe then if they want to support the narrative? But they're not. They're silent. Here you have a potential company insider, a reluctant whistleblower, saying one of the most explosive things of the whole COVID vaccine pandemic story. And as of this taping, which is 9:51 on Friday, not much is being said at all by legacy media. So, wow, we are well and truly sunk. Anyway, here is the Project Veritas video, a compilation of it.
Hey there. Is this seat taken? You work for Pfizer. My question for you is, why does Pfizer want to hide from the public the fact that they're mutating the COVID viruses?
Is this real life? I'm literally a liar. I was trying to impress a person on a date by lying. This is absurd.
Please don't touch me. Well, this is not. By the way, don't tell anybody.
Someone who's just working in a company to literally help the public. You up. You really did. Please bring the cops as soon as possible. I'm feeling very unsafe.
Can you please unlock your door?
No, don't let them leave.
Please unlock the door.
What is going on here?
Please unlock. Please unlock the door. Please unlock the door. Unlock the door. We're trying to unlock the door. Unlock the door.
Does Pfizer not want the public to know that you guys are doing directed evolution?
Bro, what is going on here? It kind of feels like an interview.
I don't know, it's freaking me out. I mean, these like flashbacks to that like sting organization of like those conservative people who like randomly go into organizations and then like befriend people who work in these organizations and then report them, which happened to people at Pfizer. And so it like freaks me out when people start asking a lot of questions about work. It's so great.
Really? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Bro, why would we back on this company?
Because I just want to know the answer.
I don't know why you're recording me. Oh my god, Jason, that'd be horrible. You better not be recording me or something.
So that was a few highlights from the encounters of Project Veritas. That was James O'Keefe mostly, and Jordan Tristan Walker. And then you heard some of the conversation Jordan Tristan Walker had with this date he was on, who was recording him before James O'Keefe got there. So you heard the phrase directed evolution, I think. So that really gives it an air of credibility too, right? It's not gain of function, it's directed evolution, but we won't know, will we, until this thing plays out. But it may play out because I learned this morning that, let me just find it here. Yes, Marco Rubio sends letter to Pfizer CEO on alleged gain of function research. And I'm wondering if this means there might be a Senate hearing, which is the only way to push this forward. Media is not going to do it, right? If Albert Bourla himself was busted by Project Veritas admitting that they purposely decided to murder people with a shot, I'm being hyperbolic here, the legacy media would not pick that up because they're all in. They're all in for the vaccine, and they have been from day one, and they can't get out of it now, right? There was on social media, I've been told, photographs of people from CBC News wearing Team Pfizer t-shirts. That really is a conflict of interest, people, when you're supposed to be doing your due diligence for us about these big companies. And let me just remind, lest you think Pfizer is being picked on, they paid a $2 billion fine for criminal behavior. They're not exactly a moral lighthouse for the pharmaceutical, for any industry right now. So that's another reason why this has some credibility. So legacy media is going to let them get away with it, at least as long as they can. And the Republicans have sent another mean letter. The mean letters don't necessarily go anywhere, but I'll just read you the first graph. An investigative report suggests that Pfizer may be conducting gain-of-function research, which it dubs directed evolution research, to mutate the SARS-CoV-2 virus to create additional, more potent variants and vaccines to combat future variants. This type of research, similar to gain-of-function research, has long been controversial and is suspected to be the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic. So he's asked a bunch of hard questions, and, Borla may be sitting with his lawyers right now. I don't know what they're doing. Maybe by the end of the day today, this will be all exposed as some kind of a scam. I don't know. I'm at my wit's end trying to get to the bottom of it. But as you know, I do present it to you because we're critically thinking here, and there are elements of this story that add up. But I don't know. I think this guy, he was so unstable. If you haven't actually seen the video that I just played for you, you should find it online, because he has a nuclear level meltdown after he's busted for. And it's not just that it's gain of function. It's that any pharma employee who gives away company secrets is toast in the business, as I said when we started this. So yikes. What a time to be alive, right? Clearly, the journalism business is over. The only people getting good stuff are doing it by going commando, right? So I don't know. I don't know what we're going to do. Let me do my pitch for you before we go into our interview with Chris Hedges, who is one of those people I could listen to talk all day long. He's incredibly thoughtful. He's a very spiritual human being. He's been through a lot. He's seen the worst side of human nature, and he's returned to, from that forefront to talk about it. So stick around for that. As you know, we are funded by y'all. And if you like this podcast, and I hope you do, because we've been trying to meet your needs for almost 2.5 years now, from the beginning of COVID, when I brought my science background to bear on some of the nonsense we were being fed. It's been a long haul, people, hasn't it? So if you like what we do here, please go to my website, trishwoodpodcast.com, and you can support through PayPal, Patreon, or my favorite, which is Substack, because they're a free speech platform. So please do that. If you are subscribed and supporting us through PayPal and Patreon, we are moving you to Substack as a free subscriber because you're paying on the other platform. So you're getting the Substacks that I'm writing as well. So that would be wonderful. Plus we have merch too. Our No Hat is still really popular, and go to our website again and see if you can find something there, because buying our merch also helps me keep the lights on around here and pay the brilliant people who help me, Steve and Christine and Dorothea, who are miracles of dealing both with my chaotic and disorganized way of approaching podcasting. I am a little chaotic, it's true. And also just some difficult times we've been through. So yeah, please do that. I'd be grateful. So here comes my interview with Chris Hedges. Right after it, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Toronto as a kind of archetype for many, many cities around the globe who are now struggling with the fallout of lockdowns and school closures. You've heard me on the show say, when these terrible things are happening, well, that's a result. They said there was going to be mental illness after lockdowns and school closures, and now we're seeing it, and no one wants to call it that. Let me tell you something. Toronto is the most boring city in the world until a year ago. It was called Toronto the Good. It is a large town, but it was always considered a sleepy town. And we now have so much crime on our subway system and our public transit that people are traveling with wine bottle corkscrews in order to defend themselves. Imagine that. So we're going to talk about that after my interview with Chris Hedges, and we'll talk about it in some detail. So here's Chris, and I'm just going to name his book again. It is The Greatest Evil is War, and this is my interview with Chris Hedges. Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. It was nice to sort of see you for that second as you came up in the video before we started rolling audio only, and just kind of see that you're still standing. I feel like you've been sort of in the thick of it for so long. And it kind of seems to me like things aren't getting better. But how are you doing?
Well, I covered war for 20 years, and I think that was pretty good training for dealing with bleakness. And nothing that I experience now, nothing really comes close to the kinds of stresses and potential danger that was often daily fare for me in places like Sarajevo or El Salvador or Iraq or anywhere else. So I think in some ways it's easier to cope with. But, we have war correspondents, I did it for 2 decades, have a very kind of bleak view of the world and human nature. And we would risk our lives often in El Salvador or Bosnia or anywhere else to report on atrocities, knowing full well that we'd wake up the next day and there'd be new ones.
Was it you who said that war is a bizarre carnival? Is that from War is a Force? I think I quoted that in my book about the Iraq War. Is that the right phrase?
I don't know. I haven't gone back and reread it.
It was such a
is
great
it a
line.
Bizarre carnival?
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, you and Gloria Emerson are my 2 favorite war writers.
Well, it's its own strange culture, which is probably impossible finally to impart if you haven't been in war. It's sensory overload. It can be hallucinogenic. You're zipped up on adrenaline, and then you never get enough sleep, and half the time you're kind of in a fog or a daze. You see things that, even to this day, I wonder, did I really see that? Because the only people who really see war are the people who are at war. The images are very heavily censored, as horrific as they can be.
Yeah.
You don't see a fraction of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's always worse, I think, than you think it's going to be. My experience was super limited. I've never been in a war zone actively, and only plumbed the psychological depths of soldiers returning from Iraq in an oral history of that war. And I honestly, Chris, I feel like I had PTSD. We did we spoke to the mortuary affairs guy for the Marine Corps out of Fallujah. And he just sort of talked about how they never leave anything behind. And that includes fingernails and, feet. And they go out and they collect it all. And he kind of went into a trance when talking about it. I asked him one question and he talked for an hour. And that kind of deep obscenity of it, I think, changes you in a sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course, and it's the worst of human evil. So you have a very visceral sense of what human beings are capable of doing, and how the line between the oppressor and the oppressed is razor thin and can often switch at a moment's notice. So when I covered the war in Kosovo, I spent most of my time writing about Serb atrocities that were being committed against Kosovo Albanians. As soon as the Serbs withdrew, it switched. I was writing about Albanian militias killing and ethnically cleansing Serbs. So I think the rule of covering war is that you don't pick sides.
Right.
You always give a voice to those people who, in that situation without you, would have no voice, would be silenced.
Do you wish you hadn't done it? It must be a kind of an interesting conundrum for you because you're so good at writing about it. You're the right messenger. And I don't know if your divinity school played into that or not, but you've also paid a price for it. And I wonder if you could take it back and not have been the messenger, if you would do that and just sort of had a normal life without that wisdom.
But it wasn't in my DNA, so it was never going to happen.
Yeah.
I'll always talk to young kids who are thinking about going to war zones, and I'll always tell them not to do it, knowing full well that if anybody had sat down and given me that talk, I would have ignored them. So it wasn't, I don't look back on it and see it necessarily as a choice. There were just all sorts of elements that conspired to drive me into that culture of war, and much of it was idealism and the heavy influence of George Orwell, and I thought that going to places like Guatemala when it was governed by Rios Montt, or I was in Argentina at the end of the Dirty War with the junta, and then of course 5 years in El Salvador, that it was as close as I was going to come to fighting fascism in my lifetime. And in that sense, like Orwell or like James Baldwin, I wanted to use my writing as a weapon. So that doesn't save you from the poison of war and from the distortions that war does. I mean, it doesn't matter what your motives are when you go in. But certainly, I think that combination of being, I suppose, a risk taker and not risk averse, coupled with the idealism, coupled with my sense of vocation as a writer, just conspired to make it inevitable.
Yeah. But I wonder also, Chris, because you bring this outsized sense of humanity, and you're a person who is able to kind of hate the war and love the warrior, which is, I think, absolutely necessary if you're covering war. But you were never in love with the bang bang, and so there seems to be two kinds of war correspondents. You know, the ones who go and they love all of the machinery and the hardware and talking about it and knowing what it's called and breathlessly reporting the violence. And then there are, in my view, special people who see it quite differently and kind of look through the bang bang into the hearts of the people who are fighting it.
Well, I think the dividing line is whether you care or you don't. And if you care, you're going to get into trouble, as I have, because if you witness and report horrific suffering, let's say, on the part of the Palestinians, it becomes impossible to be quiet about Israeli war crimes and the apartheid state, which is costly to your career. And so I would say that is the dividing line. I mean, people do go into war as voyeurs, or it will attract former military. I covered the war in Salvador with a former British lieutenant who worked for Reuters. So you're right, but I think that is the difference. There are those who don't care, that they're just very cynical. It's and very callous. And there are those that do.
So you say that you've paid a price. How does that manifest itself in your life now?
Well, when I finished covering the war in Kosovo, so that was 20 years of covering conflicts around the globe. And war reporters and photographers are a small fraternity. We leap from conflict to conflict. So often I was working with people that I'd known for years. And in fact, in the war in Kosovo, I worked with two reporters who had reported on the war with me in El Salvador 20 years earlier. So it has, after that war, which everybody has a breaking point. I didn't have a breakdown, but everybody has a limit. And I just didn't have either the physical or the emotional resiliency to keep doing it. And I struggled, like many people, to find a place to deal with the trauma, a lot of sleeplessness, abuse of alcohol, and it took me probably 3 years after I decided not to. I actually took a fellowship at Harvard and studied classics for a year, and then got shipped right back to Gaza, and was in an ambush at Netzarim Junction, where a 19-year-old Palestinian kid was shot and killed a few feet away from me. And everybody picked up an arm or a leg to carry this inert body beyond the sniper fire.
Yeah.
And I realized, I have to stop because you don't stay lucky forever. There is this kind of superstition that comes with covering war. I think anyone who doesn't have much control over their lives is inevitably superstitious. It becomes a way to cope. And I think also there's a kind of axiom which is true in that the largest numbers of war correspondents or war journalists who die are those who are very green and do stupid things, but over the ones who have done it for so long, they become very blasé because they've kind of seen it all before, and they lose that edge. They're not careful.
Yeah.
So I struggled. I mean, I still have nightmares is really the wrong word. It's kind of nighttime trauma. I still have that, but not to the extent that I did. So in my case, the PTSD has over time gotten better. It will never go away. There are all sorts of things I don't like. I can watch a war movie, or war scenes on a computer. I watched that German film, All Quiet on the Western Front, that I thought was quite good.
Yeah, we started.
Although it's not war. It's not war because the fundamental element of war is fear, and you don't get that. Plus the smells and the sounds and all that, those visceral elements are washed away from it. So it becomes more like ballet or, in this case, a morality tale. But I mean, what it told was good. But I can't see I took my kids a few years ago to see, Wonder Woman. Well, opens with this scene of Amazons on horses, which is all ridiculous, but I couldn't deal with the sounds coming through the sound system because it was so powerful. They were able to replicate sounds I didn't want to hear. So stuff like that.
Yeah. You mean like the big booming bass that comes through those theater speakers? Those big theater speakers can begin to replicate some of the sounds of war that I don't really want to hear again. Yeah. It's interesting because I went to see a film, and I forgot the name of it. I should have looked it up before we started. It came out a few years ago, and I took my 18-year-old son and my husband, and it's the film about the boats from the UK that went to France to rescue British troops. I think I've forgotten the name of it. They were like fishing boats or something. There was some rescue, but anyway,
this was Dunkirk.
Dunkirk, thank you, friend. I knew you'd know it. And
I didn't like the movie too much, but
neither did I. But and maybe this is a wrong thing to think, but they opened Dunkirk with these scenes of kind of annihilation on the beach, and there wasn't a spot of blood in any of the scenes. And it spoiled the movie for me anyway. Not that I want to see the gore, but I felt in my heart, if those young people had to live that and fight through it and experience it, then we as viewers of the film should have to at least experience something like they did. And it ruined the effect for me. Everybody doesn't agree with that take on Dunkirk. Some people were happy that you couldn't actually get a sense of limbs being blown to bits, but it was I guess the word is sanitized, isn't it, that they use now?
Well, it's all sanitized. The other thing about combat is it's just constant confusion. You know only what's happening really just a few feet around you at best. You spend most of your time trying to figure out where the firing is coming from. When I was in Basra during the Shiite uprising, after the first Gulf War, I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard, and we were ambushed on the second day, maybe, 60 miles north of Basra, 16 hours of fighting. And when I jumped from the Jeep onto the ground and crawled into a ditch, you can't, even in small arms fire, you don't very rarely see the person that's firing at you. And I looked up at the mud wall behind me to see if bullets were going into the wall, because that was the only way I could tell whether fire was being directed in my position. That's what you spend most of your time doing. And then once that combat is over, an ambush is over, a firefight is over, then they do two things. Everybody goes through the pockets of the dead, which have become human trophies for the killers. And the other thing is you create a narrative. You talk to everyone else, so you build a coherent narrative, which may be a fiction because, again, you're taking disparate pieces and trying to put them together. But I think people need those narratives to cope with those experiences.
Yeah.
That's why they do it.
Yeah, yeah. Did you know Nate Thayer, who died recently?
I did not.
Yeah.
No.
He's a very interesting guy. He's the guy who found Pol Pot in the jungle in Cambodia. It's like the scoop,
right.
The scoop of the century.
Well,
right?
I read his obit. I mean, he is one of those people who could have easily been in the military.
Yes.
There is that
yes.
kind of, and the problem with those kinds of reporters is because they have such an affinity for the military, they're very easily used as propaganda. I'm not saying he was, but they're very easily used as propagandists for the military. They're kind of, they're more reticent about defying or exposing the military and alienating the military.
Well, and he also was pretty damaged too from his experiences in the jungles up there too, right? He came back from he made a fortune on the tape of Pol Pot, like nearly $1 million, right? And as he should have, given the risks he took, but then he just spiraled down from all of it, and I'm not sure, and I kind of knew him peripherally sort of midway before he really kind of fell off. We had friends in common, and he was just destroyed by it. And nobody could ever really determine, was it the experience in the jungles? I know he was blown up. He'd had malaria a bunch of times. Obviously, he had substance. He just was a wreck at the end, and not capable of really living life. Like the last, I would say, 20 years of his life were a complete disaster. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing. It's hard to know. Did the circumstances attract him, or did the circumstances create him? It's really hard to.
I think it's both. I think people who go into war probably carry a certain amount of trauma. That's why they're attracted to war.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon. I mean, I have many, many colleagues whose lives spiraled out of control. There was a lot of drinking. And I would drink beer, but I never drank the hard stuff. And these people kept drinking after they left a war zone. There was a lot of photographers tended to use drugs. We as writers couldn't because we had to remain lucid, and also because photographers will stand up in a firefight. I don't.
Yeah.
So you might as well. I mean, I used to go into firefights in Central America, and as we got close to where the fighting was, we'd have to stop, and all the camera people and photographers would get high before they went in.
Wow.
I mean, understandably.
Yes. Yeah.
What they do is amazing, and they're disproportionately the ones who get killed.
There was a chap, I don't know if you know who this guy is either, but it was kind of a quasi-infamous case. He was in Iraq War II. His name was Michael something. He was Australian, quite handsome. War correspondent. And I remember a haunting thing he said. He obviously left Iraq. He went back to Australia. He'd been kind of a buccaneer, one of those chaps. And he had a very, very bad case of PTSD. And I remember he said, I can't come home. I don't know how to come home. I'm stuck there. And I may always be stuck there. It was really a dire assessment of where he was psychiatrically. I don't remember his last name, but he was quite a big deal.
Because you're numb, you can't feel, and you can't connect even with the people you love the most. And then when you add the sleeplessness, so I went through this. So you wake up in the middle of the night. Sometimes you remember the nightmare, sometimes you don't, but your heart is racing, you're covered with sweat, and then you just lie there till dawn. You can't go back to sleep. Well, you do that 3-4 nights in a row, and you're a basket case. I mean, just getting up and shaving and showering is kind of Herculean. And so it is a struggle to reconnect. But all of those forces conspire to make it extremely difficult. And if you can't reconnect, then you usually kill yourself one way or another.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, because I've often wondered if kind of being awake and really experiencing war the way you have and the way that the war fighters do, is part of it that once you've experienced it, you fully understand that there is a bright line between those who actually go and experience it and the people kind of blissfully going on about their lives in Walmart, right? That I mean, I had a number of guys say I'd be in Walmart after I came back and, really struggling. And I'd look at the people and I'd say, wow, they don't even know that my friends are still over there getting blown up. They're not, I'm just wondering if once you experience that, if it kind of breaks your trust in the country that sent you there.
Well, of course it does, because you were lied to in order to go. So it's not just the trauma. It's an existential crisis. Everything you were taught at school, by Hollywood, by the church is a lie, and you know it. And that existential crisis, inevitably coupled with the trauma, makes you extremely alienated from not just the society, but often the people you're closest to.
Yeah. You tell the story in your book of Mr. Arredondo or Carlos Arredondo. I would be grateful if you would just tell it for our listeners today. And then I have a little postscript for you. I don't know if you know the latest, but I'd be grateful if you would just tell that story.
Well, his son, Alex, was a Marine, killed, I believe in Fallujah. I can't remember, killed in Iraq. And when the Marines came to notify the family, he went and got a can of gasoline and lit the van that the Marines had arrived in on fire. And then, as a protest, he hooked up a trailer to his truck with a casket and put a flag over it and pictures of his son and boots and I believe a teddy bear and stuff, and drove it around the country as a kind of war protest. I mean, I also remember him talking about him climbing into the casket with his boy, the body of his boy. So what I did in this book, which is different from War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which is really drawn from my own experiences. It's not an autobiography, but it's about the culture of war. And there's a lot of things that I witnessed. This book is really interviewing people who suffer from the after effects of war. So, and I stripped it down. So, wounds that never heal. Thomas Young, who, when I saw him, was going to unhook his feeding tube, but wanted to write one last letter to Bush and Cheney. He was a paraplegic at that point and been shot in Iraq. And he couldn't hold a pen. He dictated, and I wrote it. And then it kind of ricocheted around the world. It got huge. It was hugely read. Orphans and the corpses. I interviewed a woman who was in a mortuary affairs unit in Iraq. So it's all of those aspects or the after effects of war that I think we often keep hidden within the society, and so that was kind of the and it was triggered by the kind of euphoria over Ukraine and the cheerleading for Ukraine, and not anyway justifying the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course. But it became like another sporting event, which kind of was nauseating.
Yes, nauseating. So here is my experience of Mr. Arredondo. So he kind of wove in and out of my life for a while. I was working in Washington for Bobby Mueller at the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation at the beginning of the war.
I know Bobby.
Yeah. We wrote a book together.
That's another show.
Yeah, that's another show. I know. But he brought me down to try to get the national media off the being in love with Bang Bang stuff, right? It was a hopeless case, but I did it, or tried to do it. And in the process of that, I I met Mr. Arredondo during his little protest thing. He had some event in DC that we went to, and I met him and loved him. The purity of his love for his son was
he's a sweet guy. He's a very sweet guy.
Beautiful guy. So then fast forward, I write a book about the Iraq War, and I interview the guy purely by chance who was the mortuary affairs guy in Fallujah who processed his son's body, Alex's body, right?
Wow.
I know. But here's where it gets really surreal. He is watching CNN in Fallujah. Up the TV says kind of up. He's looking up as he's processing this body, and he sees, because the van being lit on fire, as you recall, was caught on video, right? There was a shot of the house in Florida. So he's handling the remains. He's watching on Florida as Mr. Arredondo is burning this Marine Corps van, right? I don't think he realized at the time it was the same person, like it was his father of the kid he was processing. But so that was weird. But then more strangely, when the Boston bombing happened, I picked up a Time magazine, and there was that photograph of that guy whose legs had been blown off being pushed in a wheelchair to the medics by a guy in a cowboy hat who, while he was pushing this guy in a wheelchair to save him, was pinching off his femoral artery. You can see it like a piece of spaghetti in this guy's hands. The guy pushing the wheelchair was Mr. Arredondo.
Yeah, I knew that.
So right. So it's kind of like a full circle, right? I couldn't save my son who was blown up, but I'm going to save this guy. It was like, it's an astonishing story. Where is he now? Do you know?
I don't know. I've lost touch with him. I don't know. I was also in touch with him for a while.
Yeah, he's an extraordinary human being. So I want to talk, because you're right. You mentioned a minute ago Ukraine, and we've just had word that more tanks are going from Germany, and Abrams tanks, I guess, from the United States. I just feel like we're sleepwalking into a nuclear war, but that's just me.
Well, no, we don't know what we're sleepwalking into. That's what's scary, which could be a nuclear war. But there's no... these things have a life force of their own. We begin by sending them bullets, and then we have to send them Javelin anti-tank missiles and armored personnel carriers and Patriot missiles and tanks, and now, of course, the Ukrainians are asking for F-16s and F-15 fighter jets. So that's what happens in war. I mean, it's about finding ever more sophisticated machines of death. It's common to every war, but you don't control it. It controls you, and it pushes you closer and closer to a direct confrontation with Russia. And you're right. And because they've made tactical nuclear weapons, which they think are somehow more palatable on a battlefield than full nuclear missiles, that kind of, the longer it goes on, the more dangerous it becomes. And I think the consensus is now, certainly among NATO and military commanders, that this is going to be a very long conflict. It's essentially Ukraine's a very big country. It's hundreds of miles of artillery duels, largely. Putin is obviously going to throw everything he has at it. And for what? I mean, where are we going to end up? I hate to quote Kissinger, a human being I loathe for many reasons, but he's right in that, he's called for immediate negotiations. Even the New York Times wrote an editorial a couple months ago that said this call for Kyiv to seize control of all of the Ukraine, including the eastern area, which is ethnically Russian and has been for 2 centuries, is foolish. I don't know if they use the word foolish, but it's not, it's never going to be realized. So we end up with a situation like Afghanistan or Iraq, but it just goes on and on and on. And in this case, because it is a war against one of the major nuclear powers. You're right. And I think Kissinger said, we don't want to corner and humiliate Putin. We want to give him an exit. We want to give him a way out. But we're not doing that.
It's quite interesting the way you wrote about this war in the book, because you make the case that it wasn't a surprise. No one's condoning Russia doing what it's done in Ukraine, but so many things were kind of inflaming the situation that I don't know if it was inevitable, but it felt like somebody almost wanted this to happen. And what's interesting about the way you kind of write about this is that, we've done some shows with various people from, Consortium News, and we had Colonel McGregor and various people who said, look, this was inevitable given what was happening around some of the NATO promises and et cetera. And it's hard to even have that discussion because people think if you are not trapped inside the kind of Zelensky as Churchill narrative, that you're pro-war and pro-Putin, right? Those are the only two acceptable ways to talk about this. So the nuanced reality gets lost in the shuffle. And I guess I'm asking you as a reporter now to explain to me how that happens. I mean, is the legacy media just dumb? Or why are they pushing this dangerous propaganda?
The legacy media is doing what it always does, which is serve as cheerleaders for war. Philip Knightley wrote that great book, Truth is the First Casualty. This goes all the way back to Crimea. So once any war starts, the media does their patriotic duty, which is sign up for the cause. So that's nothing new. And I don't know that they're dumb. They're not dumb, but they're careerists, and they know what's good for their career. And I went through this with the inception of the war in Iraq, which I denounced publicly, even though I was still at the New York Times. I'd been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. All of us who covered the Middle East, we all realized this was extremely dangerous and foolish, and all of the scenarios that were being painted to justify the war were ridiculous. But most reporters realized that to speak out publicly was career suicide. And especially at a level like the New York Times, they're good careerists. They know what will help them advance and what won't. And those of us who stood up against the calls to invade Iraq, Phil Donahue, myself, Robert Scheer, he was pushed out of the LA Times. Phil Donahue was pushed off of NBC. We haven't ever been resurrected.
No.
And all the people who were wrong on the war are still there. Well, why? Because they're the pimps of war. They shill for the war industry. They're always assured a perch on or a megaphone because they do the bidding of the war profiteers, in essence, and the militarists. And so it doesn't matter how many times they're wrong. I dealt with Elliot Abrams and Robert Kagan when I was covering the war in Salvador. They were both in the State Department, and they spent all of their time attempting to discredit or lie, basically, responding to discredit the reporting that those of us on the ground were doing. So that's nothing new. That's what the media does. And the weaker the argument is for war, the more draconian the censorship will become. So I was talking to George Galloway yesterday, and George has twice now attempted to rent venues to question this narrative and oppose the NATO war in Ukraine. And both of those venues have withdrawn their, told him he can't hold of the events there. So the weaker the narrative, and this is a pretty weak narrative, then the more vigilant they become in shutting down the voices of opposition. So, yeah, it's all the old people. I mean, the Kagans, Elliot Abrams, Victoria Nuland, all these people, they're the ones who were behind the expansion of NATO. which should have never been expanded. I mean, NATO, founded in 1949, was designed to prevent Soviet expansion into Eastern and Central Europe. I was in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania in '89 during the revolutions. Should have been disbanded. And the idea that it's a defensive force is ridiculous. Ask any Iraqi or Afghani whether NATO was, or Libyan, if NATO is a defensive force. And I think two things happened, and I was there in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is, one, there was this hubris on the part of the U.S. who believed, remember, it was the end of history and we were going to build a unipolar world, i.e. we will be the sole dominant superpower forever. So there was that hubris. We can do whatever we want. Russia's broken. They're a third world country with nukes. There's nothing they can do. And then there was the money. So you had weapons manufacturers who realized that if they incorporated countries in Eastern and Central Europe into NATO, those militaries would have to be made compatible with NATO military equipment. And that was billions upon billions in arms sales. And that, I think those were the two factors that drove the expansion of NATO. The tragedy is that Gorbachev was calling for an economic and security alliance with Europe and the United States, as was Yeltsin and as was Putin in the very early years. But we provoked, we baited, all sorts of promises broken, including that promise made by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who was the foreign minister in Germany, and Baker, who was the Secretary of State at the time, that we wouldn't expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. And then Clinton promised Russia that we would not station troops in Germany. Now I think we have 100,000 NATO troops or something. We have a missile base. I think it's in Poland or Romania that's 100 miles from the Russian border. I mean, Ukraine after 2014, which we were clearly involved in overthrowing that government, after 2014 became a de facto NATO country, not only in terms of arms, but we trained Western military advisors, trained an estimated 100,000 Ukrainians. Part of the reasons they were able to push back the Russians. So you can't defend what Putin did. It's preemptive war. It's a criminal war of aggression, just like our invasion of Iraq was. But it's a double standard. And I hear Bush officials, Condoleezza Rice, people in the Bush administration calling for a rules-based order and all this kind of stuff. And I don't have any problem with holding Putin accountable. But, send him off to The Hague. But you got to put George Bush in the cell next to him.
Yeah. Agreed. And
that kind of hypocrisy is not lost on the rest of the world.
And so how does this end then? I mean, will this be, you mentioned earlier that this could go on for a very, very long time. Will it fall from the headlines except when they're cutting them a new check and just kind of go on and on? Or will there be an awakening that pushes people to some kind of negotiation, which I think would be fairly simple, right? Like no NATO and let us have Donbass and we're gone. I think that's kind of it, right? Or
I think that's a workable solution. Yeah. That's what they should have done in the beginning. And there were all sorts of attempts on the part of Moscow to negotiate, including at the inception of this war through Turkey, which the U.S. shut down. The other factor is, remember, Zelensky ran as a kind of as a peace candidate. He made quite a bit of the fact that he's a fluent Russian speaker. He talked about building good relations with Moscow, and you had the kind of neo-Nazi forces who delivered a message, and they're not, I don't think they're a large number. I think the best estimates are probably about 10%, but they have the Azov battalion, they have killers, and they delivered a message to Zelensky that said, stop, or you won't be around much longer, and he did stop.
Yeah. So
where does it end? I mean, we don't know. This is what's so frightening, and as in any war, you keep ratcheting up the lethality and the sophistication of the weapon systems. I suspect fighter jets are next. But all sorts of things can go wrong that you don't anticipate. A missile strike, goes over the border and hits. I mean, the convoys, arms shipments are coming in from countries like Poland. Well, you hit one on Polish territory. Does that trigger a direct conflict with NATO? Ukraine has become more, is more and more moving towards attacking inside Russia itself. I mean, it can go bad so many ways, and we don't know. So you're playing an incredibly dangerous game for what? And really for what is the two goals of the war in Ukraine are to enrich the arms industry, and Raytheon and other companies, their stocks have gone up by 35%. Everybody else's stocks have gone down since the war started, and they want to get rid of Putin. But they wanted to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. That didn't work out too well. Right. And I don't. It doesn't look to me like, I don't know. You got to be in Russia, and I'm not. I don't follow it that closely, but yeah, and so many things have backfired. I mean, Europe is paying the price economically. The German industry is suffering. Energy prices are through the roof. Inflation is ravaging Europe. And that's why I think you see a certain reticence on the part of this endless war policy within Europe. And we suffer from inflation here, but not to the extent that the Europeans are dealing with.
Well, and I think they're protected too, the people who want this, especially the Americans, because it's like a perfect conflict, because they don't have to deal with the fallout from American body bags showing up at Andrews Air Force Base, right? It's all proxy fighting that they can get behind, because they don't have that bad blowback because of negative publicity. It's somebody else's children, right?
Yeah, well, we had tons of proxy wars. I covered some of them in Central America. Yeah. So throughout the Cold War, and this replicates classic Cold War proxy war strategy. Let others bleed.
Yeah, well,
there won't be anything left of Ukraine. Are we going to rebuild it? I don't think so.
Well, I know, and I think what makes it even more bizarre for me is how, when you see Vogue magazine getting involved and putting Zelensky and his fashionable wife on the cover, as if that has any meaning. I mean, I just want to shake those people in the editorial offices there. What was the purpose of that? It's not.
Well, it's catering to the current zeitgeist, and Zelensky, as you said, even though he was a stand-up comic, has become the new Churchill.
Yeah. Ridiculous.
Yeah, it's of course ridiculous, but that is the dominant narrative, and you cater that. These are commercial enterprises; they know what they're doing. They're not going to question it. So it's. This is just across the board within the media, and Vogue is just doing what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, there's two things I want to discuss with you before we wrap up, and given that I've got you, I think it's really important we talk about Julian Assange. And you know what happened to me the other day? I had bookmarked a document in the Vault 7 file that is now gone. I cannot access. Right? I don't know what happened to it. It's just gone. Did they did WikiLeaks lose some of their funding or something? It's just vanished.
Well, there's been a constant assault on WikiLeaks sites, and of course Vault 7 was the trigger for the call to extradite Julian.
Yeah, it was really, I won't talk about the document on the air with you. I'll maybe send you an email and tell you what it said, because it was quite an important one, actually, that I thought, wow, why hasn't the media used this yet? And foolishly, I bookmarked it and didn't print it. It never occurred to me that Vault 7 wouldn't exist. And it's gone. I had such a knot in my stomach. I was so mad I didn't print it off. But anyway, let's talk about Julian, because we talk a lot on this show about sort of the end of media and how we've got to find a new way. And he's really the guy that we should be advocating for. And we don't. And I think it's just because legacy media doesn't want to talk about it. But please do just refresh my listeners' memories about why he is in Belmarsh prison and where his case is going.
Well, he's in Belmarsh prison because after releasing in 2010 the Iraqi and Afghan war logs, which exposed not only numerous war crimes on the part of primarily the United States, but coalition forces, but also the repeated lies that were told, and that juxtaposition of the public narrative with the reality, and so the empire was furious, and they were determined to extradite Julian. He was never charged with rape. That is, but yeah, that became the narrative.
Yeah.
And they used. He had consensual sex with a woman and hadn't used a condom. She wanted him, or there were two women. They wanted him to get a test for HIV or some, sexually transmitted disease. That was what it was about.
Yeah.
And that became the feeling among his lawyers. Michael Ratner, in particular, was a good friend of mine, and I used to visit Julian in the embassy with Michael. Was that they would extradite him to Sweden, and then he would just be put on a CIA flight with a bag over his head back to the United States. And that was the feeling of the lawyers. That was the feeling of Julian. And that's why he took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, political asylum in London. He was there for 7 years. The reason he was there for 7 years is because the British government refused to give him safe passage from the embassy to the airport. Then British police went in, Theresa May, and ordered them in, and they forcibly evicted him. He's now spent almost 3 years in Belmarsh prison, high security prison, and this is 10 years of unrelenting pressure. He's had a mini stroke. He's had psychotic episodes. He's lost up to 20 pounds. He was thin to begin with. He's been seen banging his head against the wall.
Oh no.
They're killing him. I mean, that's Niels Melzer wrote a very good book on it. I think maybe and Kevin Gostalo also, 2 good books on the case. I've been sat in on the trial. It's judicial farce. The UC Global, the Spanish security firm that was hired to provide security for the embassy, the Ecuadorian embassy, ended up working for the CIA and gave the CIA video footage of all of his meetings, including with his attorneys, which eviscerates attorney-client privilege. How you can charge someone who's not a U.S. citizen under the Espionage Act. WikiLeaks is not a U.S.-based publication. Of course, he hasn't. The big thing is he hasn't committed a crime. I mean, the whole thing around the way they want to get him, because the New York Times, El País, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, they all published those Iraqi war logs. The way they want to get him is that he hacked into a government computer, but that doesn't make any sense either, because Chelsea Manning, who provided the documents, didn't need Julian to hack in the computer. She had security clearance. She had all the passwords. It doesn't even make any sense. So when you follow it in that kind of detail, you realize that it's just a lynching. It's not the best of British jurisprudence, but the Lou Bianca. And they'll get him. And they'll bring him back. And Vault 7 was it. So Obama had used the Espionage Act against whistleblowers, people who had leaked to the press, I think 9 times or more than any other president by far. And then after Vault 7, which exposed the CIA hacking tools into our phones, our cars, our televisions, etc., under the Trump administration and Pompeo, the intelligence community demanded Julian's head. And so you had the Espionage Act now applied directly to a journalist, which is very frightening. So if he is brought back, which I think most of us expect probably by the end of this year, as he's appealing, but given the proclivities of the court system in the UK and how they've treated him so far, most of us are not very hopeful. But if he's brought back and found guilty, then it sets a legal precedent. So anybody who has had in their possession or has in their possession classified documents, and I have, and I've published them when I work for the New York Times, that becomes a criminal offense. And that just shuts down any investigation into the centers of governmental power. With it, corporate power is already shut down virtually any investigation into corporate power, and this shuts down any investigation into government. It just won't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I feel so helpless, and as you were sort of telling that story about him being brought here to face these charges, it's like, do we have to go and tie ourselves to the fence at the courthouse? Like, no one's listening. I mean, I've never felt so helpless as I do in the case around Julian Assange, because to any thinking person who understands the role of media in democracy, it's a slam dunk that they should just let him go. It never happened.
That's
right?
true.
So
but you have to just keep. So Julian invited me to his wedding. Julian and Stella.
Yeah.
We're only 6 people invited. The Belmarsh only allowed 6 people to come in, so I was one of the 6. Well, they didn't say yes or they didn't say no. They didn't say, well, I'm in the States. So I said to Stella, well, I'm just flying there anyway. Well, of course, when Craig Murray and we got there, they didn't let us in because they didn't want me to write it. But one of the things they work very hard to do is to make sure that Julian's not humanized, that he's demonized, and that means preventing any force or any writer or any journalist to give that human dimension to Julian, who I actually like. I mean, all the things I hear about him, it's not the person I know. I find him kind of funny and quirky and amusing and courageous. And so I went anyway. Craig and I were outside Belmarsh. And then, of course, when Stella and John, his father, and his brother Gabriel and everyone came out, I went back to the house and interviewed them all and wrote it up anyway. And that the intent was, I think, not to let me in there. And so that in and of itself is kind of validates what we do. The fact that they're worried about it, the fact that they would be so callous as to not allow his 6 guests, and they had put the number out there, the quota, 6 guests to attend the wedding.
Oh, it's really, really shocking. My last question for you, and it's a big one, is really a spiritual one. We've all been through so very, very much in the last, well, I would say decade, but if you add COVID on top of that. And I think people are really struggling, Chris. And I know that you are also you're a trained and ordained Presbyterian minister. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I don't advertise it, but that is true.
Well, okay, so I guess what I'm getting at is just that you are obviously a deeply spiritual guy in many ways. And I'm a Christian who's not embarrassed about it. So I'm not embarrassed about it at all. And I write from a very kind of religious bent. Yeah.
But the last acceptable prejudice on the left is against those of us who come out of a religious tradition.
Oh, I know. It's unbelievable.
And I'm tired of dealing with it.
I'm scared of it, actually. I'm scared. There was this whole bit up here where some of the churches were burned as a reaction to some quite inflammatory reporting about the residential schools, which were a nightmare. And our prime minister said, "Well, I understand that." It was kind of like, really, ugh. So I've stopped hiding it, though, and I do talk about it on the show. And if people, this is a show on critical thinking, right? I think some people struggle. How could you be a critical thinker and also be religious? But I don't have to explain that to people. Both are 2 sides of my brain. They can work, in concert with each other, and that's sort of just the way I am. But
but I mean the I'm not saying irrational, the non-rational forces that go into making a complete human being, the struggle for meaning, the search for meaning, the struggle with our own mortality, grief, beauty, love, none of this stuff is quantifiable. And this is why culture, our artists are so important, and it's why the best of religion, not religious institutions, all institutions, including the church, as Paul Tillich wrote, are inherently demonic. I think that's true, but I think the struggle with those non-rational forces, and of course living in a technocratic society, those were utterly cut off from that, and that's spiritual death.
It is spiritual death. I completely agree with you. And I do, because for me, the life-changing part of it is, and I say this, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've got 22 years in AA and proud of it. And they encourage higher power belief, because we got to get over ourselves in order to really recover. And then that pushed me down the road to, actually, I became Catholic, which is quite funny for people because I'm a feminist too, and they don't get it, but they don't have to. I just know that there are things about life, and certainly a lot of the stuff we've talked about today, that I have to seek refuge in some kind of spiritual thought and contemplation, because they're so huge that I would go mad without that outlet. But I don't expect other people to understand it either. It's just my thing. It's what I do. And it keeps me reasonably sane.
Well, I was very close to Daniel Berrigan, great radical priest who spent 23 months in a federal prison for burning draft records. He baptized my youngest daughter.
Wow.
And that tradition, I remain very, and my father was a minister, and he was very close to the Catholic Worker and Dorothy Day and the Berrigans. And I've never deviated from that kind of Christian radicalism that has always defined me and continues to define me. I once asked Dan how he defined faith, and he said, the belief that the good draws to it the good. He said, empirically, we may look around and there's no evidence to prove that, but that's what faith is. He said, the Buddhists call it karma. We don't know where it goes. And I think that's right. I think that is the core definition of faith. I debated Christopher Hitchens at Berkeley, Sam Harris at UCLA, a debate for which Phil Spector showed up. And then wrote a book about it. Attacking New Atheists. It's the paperback's called When Atheism Becomes Religion, I think. But I think that kind of trust, even though you can't prove it, that when we resist radical evil, that we bolster kind of the life force. I think that's true. And I just, on my Substack, which is where all my stuff is now, wrote this last column was called The Plague of Social Isolation. Yeah. Because as Hannah Arendt points out in Origins of Totalitarianism, the common characteristic of the mass, what she calls the mass man, that figure that is absorbed into totalitarian movements, she writes, isn't brutality or backwardness, but isolation and lack of normal social relations.
Yes.
It's true. Fritz Stern makes that point, himself a great scholar of fascism, fled Nazi Germany when he was about 18, taught at Columbia in the politics of cultural despair. So, and that's, a very ominous, this disconnectedness, this rupturing of these social bonds that Emile Durkheim wrote about, that creates atomy and leads to pathologies of self-destruction. And we're a rash of mass shootings in California. Yeah. I think there's been more mass shootings in this than we've had actual days this month in January. But this is evident along with the opioid crisis. 100,000 Americans are dying a year, the gambling, the morbid obesity, hate groups, Durkheim writes. And this is all laid out in my book, America, the Farewell Tour. But hate groups, he writes, are those who seek the annihilation of others or driven for longings for self-annihilation. And so we're a very diseased and sick society, and none of it's getting any better.
Yeah, so that...
In fact, of course, the pandemic is exacerbated.
Absolutely, and I think, what you just said about the mass shootings, too, I've said on the show before that, everybody was, well, not everybody, but the smart people were saying, oh, the lockdowns are going to, we can't stay in isolation. It's not good for... we're going to see a mental health crisis. And my question is, well, what did you think it would look like? This is what a mental health crisis looks like, people. Mass shootings. And we had 6 girls up here attack a homeless guy and kill him. That's like absolutely unthinkable. And they it's treated like an isolated, weird thing and not part of a larger problem to be analyzed. So my question to you, given what you just said, which I think sums up the spot that we are in very, very well and with a lot of grace. And that is, so what do we do now? How do we get, like, I've spent 2.5 years on this podcast talking about all of these things and being right about most of them. I think time has proven that. So what now? How do we survive this? Is it just as simple as hugging your kids and smelling a rose? But, what do we do to survive it?
Well, we have to make proactive efforts to break the social isolation, which means getting off of social media and building community. I mean, that finding communities, they're vitally important, which is, I use my gym. I go to the gym every day, but it's gone. The gym is closed down. And it's all the characters for years who I worked out with, one of whom supported AIPAC, another one was a right wing. He didn't actually work out. He lived out of his car and used the gym bathroom, but every right wing conspiracy theory ingested. And so the rupturing of those relationships and that isolation then fuels these pathologies. So I think that there has to be a concerted effort in whatever way to rebuild communities for our mental health, and that's not done online.
Yeah, and I think they want it. I think that the constant harassment of Christian communities and other religious communities too is partly about that, right? Because that in the olden days, back in the day, that was people's communities. Those were the communities, were religious places.
Yeah, I actually, church drives me nuts. So
really? I loved it.
Kind of like Samuel Johnson, huh? Samuel Johnson would periodically go to church, and then the sermon was so banal, he'd like storm out and write some essay about it. So, but I think whatever the community is, as long as it's a nurturing community, I don't see that Biden has taken any significant steps to dig ourselves out of this. It's just endless money for Ukraine. Yeah. And meanwhile, we have literally cities like Jackson and Detroit that don't have clean drinking water. Our infrastructure is a wreck. Our trains don't work. Our bridges are decayed. Our roads are crumbling. Our electrical grid goes on and off, even in Princeton. And that's how empires die. That is following a very classic kind of pattern of late empire, and including, of course, unchecked, unregulated militarism.
And they just lie and lie and lie. They just
they lie and they're never held accountable.
Held accountable.
Right.
It's just shocking. I can't even watch the White House press briefings. I just can't. I can't do it. I just want to put hot needles in my eyes.
It's clear that he's hanging on by his fingertips in front of that teleprompter. Yeah. And everybody around him, all his aides, are holding their breath, hoping he'll get through it.
What an insult to the country that this guy is. Anyway, what can I say?
Well, I don't know. Trudeau's not a lot better.
Oh, he's like maybe worse, and he's not even senile, right? He's just a sociopath.
No, he's just infantile.
Infantile and a sociopath. I know. It's like, what do we do? What do we do? The level of people who run for office now, that's a whole other thing, but we've got to...
Well, they're anointed. That's a Biden. They're picked.
How did he get
even
there?
In these midterms, I forget, it was $13 billion. It's insane.
It's insane.
It's just... And I worked for Nader. I was Nader's speechwriter. There's just no hope for a third party. The two parties conspire, especially the Democrats in the case of Nader, to just crush you. You can't, even as a wedge, you can't build enough of a third party to create pressure on the Democrats, which the Democratic Party in Europe would just be a far-right party. They're They, under Clinton, essentially became the Republican Party and then pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane.
Yeah, so I would love to do another show with you just on what is liberalism now, too, because I have no idea. I think I'm a classical liberal, but now maybe sometimes I'm a libertarian with Woody Guthrie overtones because I care about, I don't know what I am. I'm sick of them all.
Well, I'm a social. I'm definitely a socialist.
I know you are. I know you are. I mean, and I used to be, but I changed. That's another show. I mean, I was kind of a card carrier in that milieu until Bernie, and then I kind of blew.
Well, but Bernie, his political revolution consisted of when he lost the nomination and endorsed Clinton for us to go out and vote for Clinton. I mean, I talked to Bernie about it. I mean, it wasn't. It's you're not going to build a political revolution in an election cycle, and you're certainly not going to build one by being domesticated by the Democratic Party. But he doesn't want to lose the Senate seat. He doesn't want to end up like Dennis Kucinich, who the Democratic Party destroyed. They redistricted, so pushed him out of the House because they were sick of him. And Dennis never voted for a Pentagon budget. He never voted for those budgets. He always voted against them. So Bernie won't go that. I like Bernie. I don't think he's
I'm so surprised to hear you say that. That really surprises me, Chris.
Yeah, no, I think he's genuine in his care about the working class. I don't think that's fake.
Well, that means something.
He is a tool of the Democrats. He's voted for all this money for Ukraine. He was part of this betrayal of the freight workers, the railroad freight workers, forcing them. I mean, here, the Democratic Party in the last election said they would strengthen collective bargaining, but in the first major test of this, they revoked through legislative fiat the right of the railroad workers to engage in collective bargaining. So, no, Bernie's complicit in all of this stuff. He's not probably politically and morally fit to lead any kind of real resistance. On the other hand, he's not a fake. I think he has had a long commitment to the working class. Yeah. I think his collaboration, and I've told him, with the Democratic Party is a mistake. Yeah. His answer is, I don't want to end up, as you said to me, I don't want to end up like Ralph Nader. I don't want to end up a pariah. Yeah. And he's not wrong. That's what the Democratic Party
Well, he's
do.
An elected pariah now, though, right? Like he's got his seat, but
he's not a pariah. They just gave him the head of Schumer. Just gave him the head of the committee he wanted. He caucuses with the Democratic Party. No, he's not. I wish he was but Dennis was a pariah.
Yeah, I guess I mean a pariah. Like, you know what? For me, on the night of the convention or the weekend of the convention, seeing all those hopeful young people's hopes dashed by what he.
You mean on when Bernie endorsed Clinton? Well, I was there. I was actually with Cornel West.
Oh, I love
and
Cornel.
We were outside the convention. Yeah, Cornell's great. But we were outside with about 3,000 unhoused people, homeless people from Philly, protesting against the fact that people don't have a place to live. And those delegates walked out, the Bernie delegates, and Bernie didn't join them. And I remember Cornell, who's so prescient, turning to me and saying, Bernie just missed his historical moment. And that's right.
That's right. I was crying. I'm Canadian. When am I sitting in my living room in Toronto crying over Bernie betraying people? But I remember like the New York rally he had. There was like 20,000 young people believing in something, and it was so cool.
I know. He did betray them completely. And afterwards, when he went around the country holding rallies on behalf of Clinton, he was lucky to get 200 people.
That was kind of grotesque.
But Bernie's drew the line. He will not give up political power, and he will not confront the Democratic Party. He won't confront the war machine because he wants to politically survive.
Yeah. Very difficult right now for everybody, isn't it? How do we solve this? I don't know. But clearly democracy's failing. I don't even think we have a democracy anymore. And I say this on the show a lot. Without a working media holding people to account, we don't have a democracy. We actually literally do not have a democracy right now. So wake up, everybody. That's not what's happening. And do pay attention to Chris Hedges. Read every single one of his books, please. That's the homework on the show right now. And find his Substack, because he's a deeply, deeply spiritual and thoughtful human being.
Well, and the important thing is I'm married to a Canadian.
Yes, you are. I know. I forgot that. Yeah. And you've been married. So how's that going, Chris? Is that going well?
Canadians are great.
Yeah. Sometimes
it's not within their DNA to think they should go around the world using violence to impose their quote-unquote Canadian virtues on other peoples by force, as it is in America. So
although Trudeau is kind of celebrating the Ukraine war in a way we're not.
Yeah, I know. But look, this guy's such a lightweight.
Anyway, thank you so much for doing this. I couldn't be more grateful to you. And
not at all.
Good luck with your Substack.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a great thing. It is a great thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worked really well since I've been deplatformed on RT.
Oh, we didn't talk about that, but we will next time. Anyway,
all right.
Thank you, Chris, so much. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye. So that was Chris Hedges, whose new book is The Greatest Evil is War. And my favorite book of his so far is War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. I quoted from it in the book I wrote about the Iraq War. It's a beautifully written book. If you can bring poetry to the hellscape of war, he manages to do it. And so I think you should probably be reading his books. Okay, Toronto, the dystopian. I found yesterday on Twitter a guy named Matt Gurney, who's a journalist, and here's the story he told in a little Twitter thread. I rode the TTC, that's our Toronto Transit Commission, 3 times today. Once to downtown from my home in Midtown, once within downtown to a different place, and then home from downtown. On 2 of those 3 rides, there was someone having a very obvious mental health crisis on the vehicle with us. The first one was a young man who clapped his hands over his ears and shrieked incoherently at random intervals, and then he got off. The second, an older man, sat in a chair and screamed nonsense constantly for 10 stops, maybe more. That's just when I got off. I'm working on a bigger piece for later, so I'll save any complex thoughts and big conclusions for then. But there was something interesting I noticed today. I'm a regular TTC rider, not daily, but frequent. And for the first time today, I'm noticing gallows humor and planning. Good luck to everyone, cracked one guy. There was laughter. Everyone knew what he meant. But I'm also seeing little groups of strangers agreeing to keep watch on one direction or another, sometimes also joking about it. None of this is funny, but my gut tells me that if Torontonians are now so thoroughly convinced that riding the TTC is so risky that it's worth a dark joke, any politician who reacts to the next unprovoked attack or murder with a proposal for a national summit is going to get smoked. Right? We're screwed. That is Matt Gurney. I'm going to try to get him on the show sometime soon to talk about it, because it's not just like a local news story, right? It's not a local news story because I live in Toronto, but this is happening in New York. It's happening in LA. It's happening in London, in the UK. It's happening in San Francisco. Random violent attacks. In Toronto, a bunch of teenage girls surrounded a homeless man and beat him to death. I mean, it's nuts. That stuff never happened here before the school closures and the lockdowns, right? The mental illness epidemic predicted by everybody who was thinking clearly is now happening, and this is how it is manifesting itself in drug addiction, in violence, in homelessness, and just in sort of crazy demeanor playing itself out in public places. We can't live this way. We can't. And the problem that our mayor, John Tory, who I have limited respect for, is that they were all in on all the so-called public health measures that have now created this problem that is going to take a generation and billions of dollars to fix. We're all a little bit nuts. Those of us who are a little nuts already are more nuts. The closing of in-person 12-step programs didn't help, did it? Imagine closing AA down and having only Zoom meetings. How many people relapsed? How many people who weren't drug addicts became drug addicts because they couldn't cope with the social isolation? I will say this to people. The key to a successful 12-step recovery is fellowship. It's being together. And public health and our mayor and our prime minister and Dr. Tam in Ottawa and the SAGE group and Boris Johnson in London and Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx in DC, they all said, stay apart. Stay apart. No, your family can't come for Thanksgiving. No, no, no. They caused this. They were warned about it and they thought they knew better and they let it go on for 2 years. And now we have to navigate a dystopian hellscape on the way to work or on the way to the market. And it's not just what we have to navigate. What we're seeing, the things we do navigate, are real human beings who are struggling and ruined because the people who govern us and public health were too focused on virus suppression to understand the basic precept of human health and flourishing, which is that we need each other, right? Lockdowns didn't even work by most assessments say they didn't. I know there's a lot of fast peddling going on right now, cranking out, pardon my French, but bullshit studies to say that the vaccine saved millions of lives and lockdowns. And you look at them, they're not based on data. They're not based on real world critical thinking and study design that provides anything like a legitimate result. But these reports, and there was a new one out in Canada yesterday, they give cover to the media and public health and the government, right? They give cover. So they get a lot of publicity and no one takes them apart. So here is where we are now. Here is where we are. It's only going to get worse. We don't have the beds in rehab. We don't know what to do with homeless people who are now making our green spaces untenable and are scaring lots of people too. We don't know what to do with mentally ill people. We don't know what to do with the young people whose lives were stopped, and now that they've been reactivated, they're not coping. What are we going to do about it? And you know what? They're not talking about it. Legacy media is not talking about it. And they're saying these things are happening, but they bury the lead that they were caused by public health policy, and we need a Marshall Plan to sort this out. But they are complicit. They're all the people who should be fixing this are complicit. John Tory, our mayor, had a preposterous news conference yesterday, right? We're not going to move forward in this country and in this city or anywhere in the world until the people who did these dumb things admit that they made mistakes, right? Mistakes were made. Mistakes were made. There's no doubt about that. And then we have to find out what the remedy is. So we've got to work on a remedy. But they've got to admit the mistakes. I'm not big on punishing people. I just think we have to have a debate about what happened. We do. Because, listen, Toronto the Good is now a place where people travel with spiked corkscrews in their purses so they don't die in an attack on the subway, right? I'm just going to read a couple of things that have happened and then I'll shut it down for today. But here's what the Toronto Star, who pushed lockdowns like crazy and the vaccine and all the other stuff. A spate of violent incidents on the TTC, 5 in the past 5 days, has left riders feeling scared and changing their travel plans despite assurances from the TTC and police that the system is safe. In the latest incidents, a passenger on a TTC bus was stabbed near Old Mill Station on Wednesday afternoon, while just the day before, a 23-year-old woman was stabbed in the head and face while riding the Spadina streetcar. Let me tell you, if anybody in New York is listening to this thing, it's small fry compared to what happened there. That is probably true. But this stuff doesn't happen here, right? We've gone from 0 to 60. In the Spadina attack, police charged 43-year-old Leah Valdez on Wednesday with attempted murder. The victim is in stable condition. The victim in the Old Mill bus stabbing was taken to hospital with serious injuries while police looked for a suspect. The stabbings, which reflect a broader trend of increased violence on the TTC since the pandemic, see how they put that? Since it's the pandemic's fault, have added to a sense of unease among the public. Look at what kind of a phrase is that? Like the pandemic itself is creating violence? No, the virus isn't creating violence. It's not a zombie issue, right? Some are looking for ways to protect themselves while on public transit, while others are opting for other forms of transportation. This is very interesting because it's the same green mayors like John Tory who are trying to push us out of our cars and onto the TTC, which is clearly not workable right now, right? So they're just these people who govern us and make policy in the cities and provincially and federally. They don't know what they're doing. It's over. We need to get rid of them all. I'm a bartender and I've started carrying around a wine opener all the time to protect myself, said Emily, a York University student. I take more Ubers. I tell my girlfriend to take an Uber home. This is funny. The hesitancy comes at a time when the transit system is desperate for customers. The TTC is planning on cutting service and hiking fares this year in response to lagging ridership, which was ravaged by the pandemic. Now, that is true because everybody was working from home. Another stupid idea. Perhaps most disturbing about the attacks on the TTC is the lack of rhyme or reason in which they seem to occur in all parts of the city at all times of the day on streetcars, buses, and subways, inside and outside stations. In almost all cases, the assailant and the victim do not know each other. What is flashing here? Mental illness, mental illness. In some of the most egregious cases over the past year, an Indian international student was shot dead outside Sherbourne subway station. A woman was doused in flammable liquid and fatally lit on fire on a bus at Kipling Station. And a woman was stabbed to death at Hyde Park Station. It's enough to send chills through the spines of even the most committed riders. It's shocking. And let me add to that, and I read this a few weeks ago, that the mental health crisis in this city is also affecting the TTC in another way. And I feel for these guys. I did a story on it. The number of people jumping in front of subway trains as a means of suicide is also increased a fair bit. And every time that happens, you've got to pull back and look at what that actually means. Obviously, it means a slowdown in service, but what it actually means is that a driver in that front car has just had his life changed forever because he's experienced something that will be massively, massively traumatic for him. The sound, what he sees, everything. It's just awful for them. I know this to be true. So it's increased for them too. So what a total shit show we are living in now. And they won't talk about it, right? They'll talk about these, we're having a rise in violence. What do we do, right? They won't say, maybe we shouldn't do lockdowns anymore. Maybe our kids are all going nuts because they were kept out of school. You were warned about it, right? So I'm going to delve into this a little bit more because it's not just here. We're seeing it in lots of cities. And let's wait and see who the courageous mayor is who comes out and says, maybe we made a mistake or maybe we should have done it differently, but we've got to examine this because people need mental health resources and we don't have any worth talking about in this city. Bell Canada has a let's talk kind of, public relations thing. It's not about talking. We need beds. We need places for people to get off drugs. We need all that stuff. And if we don't do it, it's just going to get worse because every time a person is attacked, the people who witness it are traumatized too, which leads to more mental illness, right? So please, please, please start looking at the world this way and start talking to your politicians and your city councillors about this in a meaningful way so that we're not sweeping this under the carpet. More police in the Toronto TTC is not going to fix this. The people in this city and other cities are sick. They're mentally ill. They're depressed. They're sad. They are unable to switch back on the human connection switch in their heads after being told to avoid their neighbors. You can't just switch it back on, people. It's hard. And we're seeing now the result of that. It's desperate. Anyway, stay critical. See ya.
Is he taken?
What?
Hi. You work for Pfizer. My question for you is, why does Pfizer want to hide from the public the fact that they're mutating the COVID viruses?
Is this real life? What is happening here?
Why?
What is going on here? This is absurd.
Why does Pfizer want to hide from the public that they're mutating the COVID virus?
Oh my God.
You're on video. You're on video.
Pfizer ultimately is thinking about
Mutating the COVID virus.
What is going on here? I need to call the police right now. This is.
And I know this is my restaurant. I don't know what's going on.
I don't know what's going on either. This is ridiculous.
So you're on video. I'm a journalist.
Bro, first of all, I'm literally a liar.
He's on video.
Whoa.
You're saying we're exploring how the virus keeps mutating.
Yes,
one of the things we're exploring is
why
don't we mutate the virus?
I don't know what's happening. But I really need the cops here right now.
So
what is this?
Please do.
Please
do call the police. Please do call the police. Please do.
You can't do this here, guys.
Okay.
You have to leave. No, you can't do this here.
You're going to call the police. He's going to call the police for asking him a question. Please do call the police. Please do. He's on tape here talking about mutating the COVID virus. Can I talk to you outside about this?
Absolutely not. You cannot use my likeness on this. What is your name? Because you fucked up. You really did. I'm about to sue you. This is absurd. You had someone mock me as if they're going on a date to record me. You don't even know my position at this. I was trying to impress a person on a date by lying. I was literally trying. Okay. I'm not even a scientist by background. You know that I came from a consulting firm that does business. This is absurd.
Please don't touch me.
This is absurd.
So,
please call the cops here.
Please do call the cops. Please do.
Please.
Why would you call the cops if you have nothing to hide? So he's obviously having one of the most outrageous reactions I've ever seen in the history of Project Veritas. He's threatening to call the police. Okay. He grabbed the microphone. The question is, why is he calling the police?
Guys, can you just respect my father?
Please stop.
What? Can I pay their bill? Can I get a check for their bill?
Wait, no, do not give her a check. No, don't let them leave. Because I want the cops to know this.
Do you want to put me in jail for asking you a question?
Yes, sir.
What is the intention of calling the police?
They have no one's injured right now. We have several witnesses.
Can I talk to you, please, about this video?
Okay, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 white people.
Why would you bring race into this?
Please bring the cops as soon as possible. I'm very unsafe.
We have you on tape talking about mutating the COVID virus.
No one mutates a COVID virus.
Show you the May I show you the video?
No, I want to call the police, but please don't let them leave.
Do we have to leave?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I asked a question.
No, you cannot just leave.
Do you want me to
I
leave?
want the police to come here and see all of you people. Because this is insane.
Can I ask you about this
is
video?
Insane.
Please.
You can tell them about how I was
Please.
lying to impress
Here,
a date.
just was it true what you said?
What is this? No. I literally was on a third date with a guy, and like normal men, you lie to impress a date.
Mutating viruses? Do you not work for Pfizer?
This guy, I thought he was a date.
Sir, do you not work for Pfizer? Do you work
I
for?
was a contractor. What the fuck are you?
Do you currently work for Pfizer? Yes or no? Do you currently work for Pfizer? Yes or no?
What are you talking about here? Please, I want the cops to be here.
So you don't work for Pfizer?
You can't do this to people. This is absurd.
He doesn't want me to leave, ma'am.
Don't let them leave. I want the cops here now. I want the cops here now.
He wants the cops here, but he doesn't want me to leave. So I'm in a little bit of a predicament because she's asking me to leave, but he doesn't want me to leave. So what should we do?
Okay, so these people have I was on a date.
You're on a video here.
These people literally left
Look,
out of nowhere.
Pfizer is mutating the virus.
This is absurd.
Look at this
video.
video.
I literally said that. What are you talking about?
Well, this is not. By the way, don't tell anybody.
Someone who was just working in a company to literally help the public.
Why do you want to hide it from the
I don't know
public?
who you people are, and I can't believe I'm going to trust someone.
Why do you want to hide it from the public?
Stop all this stuff aside. I don't know personally.
If you suspect that mutating COVID virus, is this the way the virus started in Wuhan? Why do you think it's okay for Pfizer to do that?
We were sitting on a table.
He's filming the restaurant owner right now. He's filming her. I don't know why he's filming her.
No, don't.
Would you like me to leave? Because he won't. He's asking me not to leave, and he's consenting to my presence. Ma'am, are we allowed to just stay and ask a few questions? It's pretty remarkable that they call the police on us every time we show up and ask questions. Every time. You say Pfizer is planning on doing research in the future, then claim that there's an ongoing research about that, and that there better not be any more outbreaks. Which is it? Are these experiments happening or not? Calling the police.
We can do it right up front.
Okay.
No, do not leave. You do not need to leave. Please don't let them leave.
What's that?
Are they locked us in?
They locked us in.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah. Do you want us to leave or not?
Ma'am, you locked the door.
Ma'am?
Ma'am, we're trying to leave, but you locked us in here.
Call our attorney.
Can you please unlock your door? Let us out.
No, I don't know what's going on. I don't want anyone leaving before I know what's going on. What are you trying to tell me?
Can you please unlock your door?
No, don't let them leave.
Can you unlock the door?
I say, please, no, don't let them out. Don't let them out.
Could you please let us leave, ma'am?
I don't know what's happening.
We'd like to leave. We'd like to leave. Please unlock the door.
Like, see, now they're worried because they know what they're doing.
No.
Really being trapped. Stop. Away from me.
Please unlock the door.
What is going on here?
Please unlock the door. Please unlock the door. 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 This is remarkable here. Thank you. Thank you. You're trying to unlock the door. Unlock the door. Unlock the door.
It's not okay
Unlock
to
the
put
door.
people like that. It is not. Stop. Let go of me. Now you're hurting me. What is going on here? You cannot just record people like that.
Come on.
It's not okay.
Come on.
It's not okay.
Let's go. Let's go. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Come on. We're in New York City. This is remarkable what you just witnessed here in the restaurant. Come on, guys. Where's the car? Where's the vehicle?
Keep walking.
Come on. This is insane. You just witnessed one of the most remarkable interactions ever. Do we have the iPad? So we're getting into the vehicle now. Where's our car?
Stop. Stop. That's not them. Stop. Cop, stand right there. No. Stop.
He's charging the guy, charging.
You can't make an arrest at this point if you don't have the victim right here.
Okay. 'Cause if he was here, you'd arrest that guy?
If he was here, yes.
Oh, then we could just walk away then. Not worry about it.
If that's what you guys want to do, then yes.